where the most powerful source of heat sends its rays to all. History will show us what will come. That was 1873, Augustin Mouchot, a French inventor who developed the first solar-powered mechanical engine way back in the 19th century. It's taken us a while to get here, but the energy transition is underway. And as we discussed in last year's edition of this dialogue, this is not just the first energy transition. So rather than just the macro story of gigawatts installed or aimed at, we need to dive a little more deep into what the energy transition looks like in different countries, what will shape it, and what will the future of the electricity system look like in the economies of the future. The electricity system that we see today looks pretty much the same as what it was in the late 19th century. But will we say the same even 50 years from now? How will we integrate many more, not just sources of energy, but many more points of energy production and consumption? How will we bring together transformations in electricity with transformations in mobility, with storage, with heating, cooling, industrial energy? How will we integrate these technological developments with the business model and the financial innovations? And how will all that drive change in human behavior? To kick us off on this first plenary on the electricity systems of the future and the economies of the future, I have the privilege to welcome CEEW's founding trustee, Mr. Tarun Das. Sir, would you please come up on stage? I would also request our other stellar panelists to join Mr. Das. Mr. Praveen Kumar, Additional Secretary of the Ministry of Renewable Energy, New and Renewable Energy. MNRE has been partnering with CEEW for the last 3 years on this dialogue. Mr. Kumar, thank you very much for your support. Ms. Rana Adib, Executive Secretary of REN 21, flown all over to us from Paris. Thank you very much, Rana, for joining us. Mr. Kevin Kadri Nassir, the Executive Director for Energy of the City of Cape Town. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us and for hosting CEEW just a few months ago when we presented our analysis about South Africa's energy transition out there. Mr. David Palchak from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States. And last but not least, Mr. Thierry Leperc, who's now the founder of another new company called SolarStream. I first met Thierry when he was the founding president of Solar Direct, one of the companies that drove down prices for solar energy in India significantly. And now Thierry is driving innovation in many other areas. So we're going to hear from him. Thank you, Thierry, for joining us. Mr. Das, over to you.
Yeah, I think you can move up.
I will now request Kanika to deliver an opening presentation.
Great. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and eminent panelists. So before you begin your discussion, I'd like to propose a few questions for you to possibly address while you're debating what the electricity systems of the future are going to look like. And this is going to draw on some of the recent research that we've undertaken at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. After that big opening, several of you know what the Council on Energy, Environment and Water is, but I'm going to give you a very quick update about the research areas that we work in. So we work on 8 different research areas, which we divide in here and now issues, which specifically focus on energy access, renewable energy, and the power sector. But then we also try and take a longer term view where we think about deep decarbonization of the energy system for the middle of the century in our low carbon pathways work, and also think about industrial sustainability and competitiveness, as well as the impacts of climate stress on the lives of our communities in our risks and adaptation work. There's also over the horizon questions, which is really what's going to form much of the discussion today, which is work that we explore further in our technology, finance, and trade program, as well as work that we do at the Center for Energy Finance that you've already heard a little bit about and will hear much more about over the coming day and a half. That said, there's really, interestingly, when we think about what are the transitions happening, and the energy transition is sort of this blanket term that we hear about all the time, and we've heard about it several times today already. But the transition isn't really actually one transition. There are several sub-transitions that are happening. And the three real sub-transitions within the electricity system are the ones that are around decarbonization of the electricity system, decentralization of the electricity system, and digitalization of the electricity system. So decarbonization, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's what we've been discussing. It's also about increasing the share of renewables, but also thinking about how do you make the existing thermal and other fossil fuel-based technology systems more efficient and less carbon intensive. But decentralization is really where the innovation is required. And are the markets ready for that? So are we ready to move away from large integrated assets that produce many, many, many kilowatt hours and megawatt hours of electricity at a time to much more smaller systems that are on our rooftops or that are within our cars and act as almost like moving storage battery units? What is the future going to be if it's so decentralized? What's going to tie it all together? And that is the third revolution, the revolution around digitalization, which will tie all of these different moving parts together and also enable a much more demand-side management where you actually can work with consumers to make their demand better sort of streamlined and understood by them as well as by those who are managing the load. So this then takes me to the work that we've done. Sorry, there's technology and I are not friends. So we've been looking at three emerging markets to really see what are the lessons that these markets can learn from each other. And so three markets that we've looked at are, of course, India, but also South Africa and Indonesia. And what we find is that despite the energy transition being underway in all of these markets, there are several risks that impede the pace at which this transition is happening and predominantly plague the flow of capital into the clean energy markets in these countries. And so while the intensity of the risk differs in different parts of the world, there are some risks that are common across countries or at least occur in more than one country, and that actually gives a lot of opportunities for collaboration, for jointly addressing these, but also to make discussions like this much more interesting. So in that context, we'd like to actually propose that are we going to change the energy system in the way that we generate electricity? Are we going to change the way we consume it? Or are we going to actually change the entire value chain from generation to retail to market design to market operations? And lastly, for you to debate today, what is the role of public money in driving this transition, in accelerating the pace of the transition? What are the different mechanisms, and what is the way that government can spend its money in the most effective way to accelerate the pace of the transition that we are seeing in these emerging markets? So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mr. Das. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanika. We could spend the whole day doing this, answering all your questions. But we have limited time, and we need to be speaking more in bullet points, as it were, so that we can stick to the time limit that we have. I'm going to start with the gentleman on my left, Mr. Praveen Kumar, Additional Secretary, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. You heard Arunabha earlier, if you were here, that India has come from a place somewhere out there to a different place now. And the target for the future is very ambitious. So we need to understand how you see this transition happening, what's happening on the Indian context, and what is it that drove this evolution Was it market signals? What drove this new energy in the Indian context? And when you look forward, you have two different objectives: electrification, taking electricity to every home in the country, and clean energy. How are you going to match these? You have a grid issue and all of that. So as briefly as possible, Mr. Praveen Kumar, you're central to all this. Let's listen to you.
That's a big spectrum. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, from the entire spectrum of the energy, and as short of time I can say, I'll try to. One good thing, I'll appreciate CEW to start talking about the future, because it looks it's just the last around 4 years ago, when we fixed a target of 175 gigawatt for renewable energy. That looked something like a leap in some very far away future, because when we are working at 2 gigawatt of solar, talking of 100 gigawatt of solar in another 7 years, that was a leap of faith in the dark, because actually we didn't know at that point of time how we are going to reach that. But based on the political drive, where initially money was provided for pushing in renewable, even though it was costly, and some luck because of technological changes, because of which renewable became compatible, commercially compatible with the fossil fuel. So perhaps for the first 2 years of this drive, we had to support it with funds, this renewable expansion. After that, it became economically viable for everyone to go for renewable, apart from other technical problems. But as far as the cost of renewables, it came down, both wind and solar, which has been driving. And now, thing which was supposed to be just very, very far away looks achievable, and we are going to achieve this 175 gigawatt in 2022. So that is no longer future. This 175 gigawatt, we take this as present. This time has come to start talking about further down the road, perhaps 2030 and even beyond. So what I feel that two things are going to drive the renewable story after 2022. One thing is fighting climate change will remain the central driving force, because that will have to be if our next generations are to survive, have to have this world, we have to fight the climate change. There's no option. And the other thing will be the renewables. The cost will become compatible not only from the absolute cost of the electricity unit, but also including the cost of absorption in the grid. So that is also going to come down. And we are going to see a lot of technological disruptions in the sector. So it becomes very difficult to predict also how we are going to do. So let me take you one by one. As far as the traditional calculations go, we are expecting a demand of around 2,400 billion units in 2030. I mean, and that includes all houses have been connected to the grid nowadays. So every house has electric power. So demand to come from that, and also electrical vehicles. That will be you must have read stories that by 2025, the government is planning that all 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers should be electric vehicles. And also the 4-wheelers, etc., and public transport gradually shift by 2030 to electric wheelers. To electric vehicles. So that will be a big demand. So for this 2,400 billion unit, rough calculations which we have done shows that the total capacity of power which should be there in the country by 2030 will be around 800 plus gigawatt, of which we expect 450 to 500 gigawatt to come for renewables. And when I say renewables, I say it in the Indian context, where the large hydro, which even though it is renewable, we don't include that in renewable. If we add that, it will be 500 to 550 gigawatt will be in the renewable. So that is more than almost 60% capacity will be from the renewable sector itself. But for this to be absorbed, we are hoping for a lot of technological changes. One biggest thing we hope, storage will follow the same story which solar has followed. The way solar prices have fallen in the last 4 years, I think similar things storage is seeing. It is still costly to become mass based, but by 2022, 23, 24, the cost will come down. It may be lithium ion, it may be new technologies. Hydrogen is doing well. It may be even gravity, anything, so much research is going on. So storage will be, renewable plus storage together will become a viable unit in itself. Once this becomes viable unit in itself, what I expect is that distribution companies will have to undergo a big change. The present system of distribution companies supplying power to everyone may not be possible because each unit, each house, each dwelling will be an autonomous power source for itself. They will produce power, they will save power, use it when the power is not being produced. But we need distribution companies for backups, for bigger usage. So distribution companies won't disappear, they will have to remain. But the model, financing model, the working model will have to change. Many of the distribution companies in India have already started adapting to it, the way they are encouraging renewables, even the BESCOM, the way it is rooftop, the 33% to 35% is rooftop solar there. So this will, and distributed solar thus will become the norm. Not the present drive of India has been driven by is through the large scale utility solar. But once the storage becomes very common, it will become more of a distributed solar will become more popular. That's my expectation. And apart from that, storage has another role in the grid balancing will be very important. Because the way forecasting, scheduling, even though there is a lot of improvements going on in forecasting and scheduling, and it may but still renewable, whatever good thing is, it's an informed power. It's like a deviant child. It's good, but doesn't behave properly. It comes, goes, sometimes doesn't come. So lot of effort is required to take it into the grid. So storage will be via media will become very easy to take them into the grid. Even RE, I suppose it is present RE of silica-based cells may change over time. You may have new materials of higher efficiency, the same area. One problem with solar we face is that large propensity to need of land is very high. So much land may not be available. So higher efficiency of solar cells which will be new perovskites, organic cells. A lot of things are research is going on. Something will click with that. So new technologies will come in. Financing also, a lot of changes will be there. One thing, green has also anyway become glamorous, so funding of green will become very attractive. As a standalone thing, I want to fund a grid will be an objective of many funds. So like companies like IRIDA, which is basically a green bank for India, not green NBFC, I will say, which funds only green. So such companies will rise in numbers and more funding will come, international funding, etc., for these such kind of companies which are green, which are primarily funding renewable story. Then risk mitigation measures will have to increase because the risk assessment of non-AAA consumers is very high. So we are also working in various risk mitigation mechanisms so that the lesser grade consumers also are funded by various funds. Other thing which may change is this long-term PPA. So we have 25-year, 30-year PPA. That may also undergo change. Perhaps distribution companies nowadays they contract almost 100% of their demand through long-term PPAs. That may come down. They may go more for the exchange, shorter-term PPAs. So accordingly, the renewable energy producer finances also will have to be changed, more market-driven. So it has to be more firm. That will have to firm power. They will have to supply. Then modern, as you said, digitization. Kanika used the word. So modern technology is going to play a big role, like artificial intelligence, blockchain, both in grid balancing and smart metering, all those things, because ideally the grid should be able to sense where the demand is going to go down, which area is going to go up. All those things will become very practical, very normal. And anyway, smart metering, already government is shifting slowly to smart metering. The stepwise, the costly process, and prepaid metering, that will become more common. So this is a broad gamut under which various changes in future will occur. based on questions, I can elaborate later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to turn to the lady on my right. RENT 21 has been monitoring the evolution of renewables, renewable energy for over a decade now. And I have a two-part question. First is, what is driving the change, as you see it, specifically in the electricity sector? And second, there are areas like heating, cooling, industry, where it's much slower. And what is it that needs to happen to drive the change there?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. So I'll start with the second one, and I'll come back to this again. But I feel that on the three transitions which are needed, these three transitions of decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization are leading in the electricity sector to two other ones. One which is the strongest sector integration with the end-use sectors, whether it's heating, cooling, transport, agriculture, etc. The other one is that we do see an electrification trend happening in these sectors with the development of electric mobility, with the development of heat pumps together with solar PV, which are in many countries more competitive than solar thermal application. And this also leads to other visions, I think we spoke about horizons here, of developing new types of fuels, electric fuels. And that's something which is clearly a trend we do see. There is a much stronger integration of these different end-use sectors compared to the conventional fuels, where the transport sector was pretty much separated from heating, cooling, and electricity. Now, in general, what is driving, I guess, the transition to renewable energy? Obviously, there are questions of climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And I think especially in the electricity sector here, the decentralization of renewable energy brings a higher resilience to climate change impact. So we do see that clearly there is this motivation. We see more and more air pollution as a big driver here. Social and economic developments. And these are, I think, energy security is another aspect. Now, why did it pick up in the power sector more than in other sectors? I think it's today we really see a development of solar PV and wind in particular because they are cost competitive. We're talking about cost of 20 euros a megawatt hour. And when we're looking at the auction in Brazil, there was a technology neutral auction, which means like all different technologies, power producing technologies could apply, and the bid went to solar PV and to wind solutions because they are today cost competitive when we're looking at the generation cost and the least cost option. This is a result of continuous and long-term policy attention and regulatory frameworks. In the years of 2000, there were some pioneering countries which took the risk to invest in these new technologies, which saw that there was an opportunity for industrial developments, pathways, commercial developments, created market conditions and pilots. And as a result, innovation could happen, skill sets could build up, industry could build up, which led then to these cost reductions. Why is this not happening in the other sectors? You mentioned, or somebody mentioned, I think, in electricity worldwide, we have 26% of electricity is covered by renewable energy. Oh, I mentioned it this morning, actually. 10% in the heating and cooling sector, and only 3.3% in the transport sector. This is just a result of lacking policy attention. There are 135 countries which have policy and regulatory frameworks in place to advance renewable energy power. There is only 70 countries which have this for transport, and here we are basically speaking about biofuel mandates only. And there are only 20 countries which have regulated frameworks to advance, policies to advance renewable energy in the heating sector. Now, there is always, when there is a question, and we have always a question, are you positive or negative about what renewable energy can provide? And I am very positive, because in the power sector we do see that all this innovation is really happening and possible. A couple of years ago, people were freaking out, and freaking out is still nicely said, thinking about the fact that they could have shares of variable renewable electricity in their grids of 5%. Today there are 20 countries which have over 20% of variable renewable electricity, and the solutions, flexibility options do exist with regard to this. So I'm very confident that by bringing the policy attention also to the other sectors, we're able to advance the transition. What is important here, I think, is clearly take into account, we always hear the inclusiveness, and I think the inclusiveness means today, if we're serious about the different sustainable development goals, climate change, economic opportunities, but also resilience of manufacturing industry and export markets, for instance, it means that we need to broaden our discussion and debates to the sectors which are not renewable energy sectors and not only energy sectors. And we need to better understand how energy is being consumed and regarded by these energy consumers to include them in the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rana. I'll stay with my right. David, I'll come to you next. Much of the discussion on the energy transition area is about the supply side, green supply. What about demand? What about demand management? And does it have a role? How important is it in driving the energy transition? And the second part of my question is the grid. You look at the grids and variable renewables and integrating them, and the legacy of maybe poorly designed constructed grids. Is it possible to develop a different kind of a power system? Do you see something happening here which can help this whole process of energy transition?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here. So I'm going to take the second one first, if you don't mind. So, what we're looking at from kind of the research perspective when we think about the grid and grid integration is really kind of going to the root of some of the perception issues with renewable energy and the way that a lot of technical institutions might not be comfortable transitioning to clean energy. And so I think one of the root causes is the way that the grid has been operated and planned over many decades at this point is essentially hasn't changed. And so clean energy kind of upends that. And there's a lot of changes that need to happen to improve the way we see the grid and improve the way we plan the grid to be able to allow renewables to be successful. And so helping some of the utilities, the discoms, the system operators with their planning tools and thinking about renewable energy will really help the perception of renewable energy and what might not be a comfortable thing for people that whose job is to keep the lights on. And so I think it's really important to be empathetic to their plight of having to keep the lights on, and helping to realize that a lot of the tools and the research done from places like CEEW and NREL, there are solutions for helping to get to that next step for the very important grid integration question. From the demand side, I think there is a lot of opportunity. I'm also a little bit skeptical because it is kind of taking it from the bottom up as opposed to the top down, which the power sector has really come from. That's where a lot of the policies and the regulations can come from and impact how the system is planned and operated and allow for a transition. From the demand side, I think there's a lot of promise in the long term, and it's certainly it's exciting from a technology perspective, and it's hard to ignore the excitement of new technologies and all that it can offer. But I think we need to be realistic about the fact that there's a lot that can be done on the supply side and on the policy side from the top down that can really help things in the short term, and in the long term, maybe looking to the demand side as helping with that transition. And I also think from a utility perspective, it's a little bit difficult to manage the demand side. And right now it might be difficult to ask of them while they're going through a transition to clean energy to kind of change the whole dynamic of a utility. But I think in the long term, certainly there's promise and there's definitely cost savings from being able to control those things.
Thank you, David. I'm going to turn to South Africa. You've heard about, Kadri, you've heard about the India story in brief from Mr. Kumar. The political economy of changes in developing countries can be very challenging, especially for the power sector. Very complex, and perhaps equally so or even more so in South Africa. You must have got legacy issues to deal with, like we have in the power sector. How do you move towards a clean energy future? What is your sense of what's happening in your country and where you can go? And with much of the clean energy innovation happening in the developed world, really, not so much in the developing world, do you think our countries in the developing world will be able to participate and share the gains of this paradigm shift in the energy sector? Kadri.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you to Arun and to your team. I think hosting us has been fantastic. I look forward to a long and profitable relationship with our Indian colleagues. I think it's really no surprise that India and South Africa are sharing a platform on such an important occasion. South Africa is a much smaller country, but some of the challenges we will see are very, very similar. And in fact, I have just had the experience now of observing the water crisis that Chennai is facing, along with 3 other Indian cities that are within the top 20 in the world. And these are warning signs that Cape Town, which I represent today, has gone through roughly 2 years ago. And so we have a lot of lessons that we need to be sharing with each other. And these can all be traced back, of course, to the advent of global warming and climate change. And so platforms like these need to be shared more often so that we can take lessons that we've learned in Cape Town and hopefully apply them here so that Chennai and some of the other cities don't have to go through what we did with our pending day zero. And I see that phrase has caught on even here in India. But turning to the energy market for a second, and the energy market in South Africa is in a crisis. And this crisis is brought about through various factors, corruption being one of those, but also an unwillingness or inability to transform the electricity supply industry in the country. And as a result of that, we have a single large utility, which is vertically integrated, and that utility is on the verge of collapse. It is currently within a debt and death spiral, and if it does collapse, threatens to bring the entire economy down with it. And to illustrate that point, just to share with you that the contingent liabilities that sit with our national government in the form of our national treasury amounts to 10% of our GDP. Now that contingent liability is just to bail out the utility for the sovereign guarantees that have been provided for. That is 10% of our gross domestic product sits right there in the hands of one company in the country. With that risk, and Kanika mentioned, of course, some of the risks that are faced in our markets. It's not just demand risks. It's also the risk of pending economic collapse that sits with a market that is so dependent on one particular company. And where that has parallels in other emerging economies is the growing dependency on the state to provide for guarantees and to provide for, in many instances, to provide for subsidies and other incentives that are designed to, in some cases, make a non-viable market suddenly seem viable when it's not. Many people have spoken about renewable energies being more expensive. Just before the session, we spoke about the project in LA, where we have the Elan project, which I think is a 400 megawatt project, coming in at a cost of 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. That is not expensive. Couple that to storage, where the cost is about 1.3 US cents, and you have a viable project. Now, this is what a city like Cape Town in South Africa is responding to say that we require autonomy to protect our citizens from the rising cost of electricity, a cost which is increasing dramatically beyond the levels of affordability for most of our citizens, brought on, as I said to you, by the debt spiral that the national utility faces. As a result of that, we've had to take drastic measures. Now, in order for you to succeed in terms of any global transition, you're going to have political backing. So you need policies, strategies, legislation, and regulations in place. But you also need the technology component in place to support that. Lastly, you need the social element to ensure that on the demand side, you have a willing market that's ready to adopt such a change. In our country, we have many of those policies in place, but what is fundamentally lacking in our market is the ability of our local authorities to be able to decide for themselves what form of power they want to uptake. And as a result of that, the city of Cape Town has taken the bold step of challenging national government and is taking them to court. So that's a first in the country, where one sphere of government is now legally challenging another sphere of government. So in the week of the 5th of August, we should have the start of a process in which the courts will decide to what degree do cities have the power to actually purchase their own clean energy versus what they're currently receiving from the state-owned electricity utility. So it's a fundamental game changer. It'll hopefully bring about the type of change that we're looking for. Cape Town sees itself as a very progressive city. We have faced pending day zero on our side. We've survived so far, touch wood. But we also see that our citizens have been facing load shedding, which is another phenomena which we've become more accustomed to in South Africa, which we've never had before. As a result of that, we've now looked at different mechanisms by which we can make a better transition. So for example, moving away from consumerism towards prosumerism, where we actively encourage our consumers to become generators and have a power plant effectively on each rooftop. That for us has become one of our biggest imperatives. In order to enable that, we're supporting what is known as the Property Assessed Clean Energy Model, or PACE, with the intention of bringing in external funding to provide for long-term financing options for the provision of capital for options like PV, storage, and rainwater harvesting, and other means as well that are required. This is but one instrument which we are looking for, which we can discuss, that will hopefully allow for consumers to become more active participants. If you wish to migrate to a smart grid, this is the technology component. The grid is only as smart as its users. And ultimately what we are trying to do is to capacitate our consumers to become more active participants in their marketplace and to be able to make informed choices. To do that, they need access to funding, they need access to technology and other platforms in order for them to effect better communication. And this, we believe, are going to be the crucial elements where we can all take those lessons from there and help to create a better and safer transition.
Thank you very much. Thierry, I've come to you last because in everything that people around the panel have talked about, there's an underlying reference, without necessarily mentioning the word, innovation. Innovation, is it only about new technology? Because for me, the conversation we had a little earlier gave me the sense that you are very much involved and have been involved with innovation. Is it only about new technologies? Is it about behavioral shifts also? Are emerging economies test beds for application of innovation? How do you see this? Share your thoughts with us, please.
We don't have time for innovation. It's game over. I mean, we're talking like things are progressing. I'm coming from a city where for 5 straight weeks we have 35 degrees of heat, like Mumbai. That city is called Paris. We've had 5 degrees more additional degrees in the last 4 weeks that we've had normally. Actually, I should say normally because last year it was the same. What we're seeing is that this place is on fire and this place is a planet. And we don't have time. We need to get out of fossil fuels. I mean, let's call it that way. It's not decarbonization. It's zero fossil fuels now, immediately, or we all fry. And this is very simple. And I'm astonished at how lighthearted everyone is. We are burning. And the good news, now I'll tell you good news from Europe. Europe is waking up. As we speak, the new chair of the European Commission has set her sight to zero carbon by 2050, carbon neutrality. The government of the Netherlands has decided to go zero natural gas, to exit natural gas. No single home in the Netherlands will be connected to natural gas by 2030. France will exit coal, completely exit coal in 2022. Germany will exit coal, completely exit coal, and that is tough for Germany, by 2038. Add to that the intention of the European Commission to go zero carbon for European industry. We're talking 500 million people going zero carbon for their industry by 2030. At New York, the New York State, zero carbon for electricity by 2040. California, zero carbon, entirely renewables by 2045. Now that sounds a lot of numbers and objectives. And the question is, how do we get there? Now I think what was mentioned earlier are fundamental things. And here, we're in the developing countries with people thirsty for energy. I'd like first to thank India, because when I came here 10 years ago, as a small business starting solar projects in France, we got trust from people here. I was just talking with my colleague Gaurav Sood just a while ago, and with Gaurav we built a 1 gigawatt business here in this country. And I was just asking Gaurav, how long does it take to build a power plant here? So, or when he told me a little over 13 months, 15 months. That's 5 times faster than we have in France in particular. So I owe a lot to this country, and thank you, Arunabha, to mention what we did in this incredible period preceding Paris, when we'll write a book on that. That was a funny part. But it's not the time to slow down. And it seems to me that people are in a slow down atmosphere here, while we are in a problem. Now the problem is big. And I think it was mentioned before by the first keynote speaker. The first thing about energy is not decarbonization. First thing is availability, it's security. There's no economy without availability of energy. Some people call that energy access, or you call it that your way you want. And if you're an industrial company, you need energy every single day. That's the first thing. The second thing is affordability, and it was mentioned. There's no energy if it is not affordable. That is a joke to say that we can afford more expensive energy. The people who say that are liars, because obviously affordability comes at the expense of access. So you need these two things. And obviously you need zero carbon. When? Now. So, hey, you'll say, you've described an impossible circle. How do we get there? Maybe innovation. Fast and big. We need to be fast and big. And 5 years ago, there was a man who said, I'm going to do something fast and big. And it was Prime Minister Modi. I tell this story to everyone I know. I tell him, the man must have been considered crazy. We had this conversation with him. I'm multiplying by 5 my objective to 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022 while I was 20. Who was going to believe me? And he did something smart. He called upon the people at Reinvest in 2015 and said, he called upon the developers, he called upon the investors and said, I have, not a dream, I have a fucking objective that is 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022. Who's in? Right? I think. So I was, as the CEO of Solar Direct, which was not yet bought by NG, a large company, so we had about 100 megawatt built then, and I signed a piece of paper addressed to the Prime Minister saying, Mr. Prime Minister, we will build 2 gigawatts by 2022. Well, after all, we're halfway to that objective with the company which is now NG Solar. By the end of the week, that was in February of 4 years ago, Prime Minister had, correct me if I'm wrong, 263 gigawatts of objectives. It was not a decision by, sorry, Mr. Secretary, by the ministry. It was moving from industry. It was moving from communities. It was moving from bottom up. This is what we need to do today. And I'm glad to tell you, well, I shouldn't say that, but this is confidential, but, well, I won't tell you everything, but 4 months from now, in Rotterdam, in the port of Rotterdam, we will launch a similar challenge with a very, very well-known figure of climate change. I won't tell her, with the support of the European Commission. And we are going to aim at 100 gigawatt. 100 gigawatt of what? We want to solve the issue of industry. We want the issue of heat. I'll give you an example. The world's largest fertilizer company. This is for real, huh? This is not just a plan. My new company signed 4 weeks ago, that's admittedly recent, an agreement to develop and build a 50,000 ton hydrogen. So I've never used that word. Hydrogen is, you know solar power? Now imagine that you use that power with water, in a split water, and you have on one side hydrogen and the other side oxygen. A guy said 145 years ago, hydrogen is the fuel of the future. It was Jules Verne. I encourage you to, as a French author who predicted space travel and other things. And I'll just end up with this thing saying, if you have the largest fertilizer company in the world, which by the way has a huge plant not too far away from here in Uttar Pradesh, which is saying, I can feed, the guys say, we are feeding 400 million people. So that scale, impact. Converting my fertilizers, which today use fossil fuels, which use natural gas under the form of what we call steam methane reforming, hugely emitting natural greenhouse gases. If we can shift this plant in Bordeaux 500,000 tons of fertilizer produced annually. If we can convert it in 5 years, because that's the objective, entirely to zero carbon with product that comes from solar, if that can happen in one plant in southwestern France, well, maybe it can happen here. Maybe it can happen everywhere. And maybe you can solve this incredible trilemma, which is to say, how can we have affordable, dependable, and zero carbon energy for everyone now? So the challenge, if I may answer the question on innovation, is be bold. We have the technologies. It's not let's invent new technologies. We need to invent or implement the model. We need a Modi-like vision. And this is why I'm very happy to be here, because this is the kind of vision and energy that we need, because the tools are here, we can make it happen.
Thank you very much. So you've heard 5 different perspectives. India, South Africa, the REN role, and I hope you will continue to do what you're doing, and more power to your elbow. The grid and the demand side, especially the grid issues, and what you've just heard from Thierry. How are we doing for time? We have time, so we can continue the conversation, or we should break? What are the instructions? Okay. So would some of you like to engage with each other? Anybody have a question? Rana?
I definitely would like to engage. I would, building on what Thierry said, I completely agree on the urgency and the solutions are there, and I think this message needs to be out. I also see positive trends in terms of policy ambitions from some countries. Unfortunately, when we are looking into the investment, they have gone down globally by 16%. also in this country. No, I think 11% globally, 16% in India. And unfortunately, when we're looking into the ambition, we still see 200 gigawatt of coal-fired power plants already engaged in Asia. Some key countries which are high emitters who do unfortunately not follow this engagement. And I think this is where it's also important to get basically the message out there that technologies do exist, that they need to be implemented, but that they also need to be taken into account in the policy vision, actually, and in the support which is needed here. Because otherwise there are still interest groups who are not going to take into account the solutions which do exist. What I think is really interesting when we're looking into the fact that electricity is today, renewable electricity is a least cost option, that with electrolysis we can produce hydrogen, and that there are really other players coming into the field. And so I mentioned the transport market, you mentioned the agricultural industry, so chemical industry, all the industry players do need renewable-based heat. I think this is a real opportunity, and this also means that we need to engage not only the energy policymakers, but much on a much broader scale. Finance ministries need to sit here around the table. The economic ministries need to sit around the table. And when it comes down to the inclusion, we also need to talk to the trade unions, which today, unfortunately, also in Paris, are fighting very much against the transition, not because they are against the transition, but just because the transition is not being communicated in a good way to many stakeholders. And I think there are some aspects, I share the urgency, I share the optimism, but I think there are some aspects which need attention, because otherwise it might be firing back.
I don't want to make this a bilateral with you yet. I'll just come to Mrs. Saurabh Kumar first to comment, and then we'll come back to others.
The objective of not having fossil fuel is a very noble one. There's no objection to that. But different countries are at different levels of. Perhaps some countries will have to be given a longer rope to remove the fossil fuel. That's all I'm saying. Especially when we see that renewable per se on their own, they can't give firm power, which is requirement of the industry and the economy. And we need some balancing power in terms of either hydro or fossil. Fortunately or unfortunately, India is dependent now on fossil fuel, and we have committed to reduce the fossil fuel over time. And we are moving much faster than that commitment. Rather, the way it has projection, it will come down to 20% of the total capacity from the fossil fuel by 2030. So.
Mr. Kumar, you think we are on track for implementation as you look ahead to the next few years?
See, the intermediate target of 175, we are totally on track. That will be achieving, no problem. We are already planning for 24 and 30. So, only thing what we are trying to go out of the state jacket. We want to bring in manufacturing also. There are some issues. Storage, that is a very, very critical area for renewable to go beyond 175, because beyond 175, the storage is costly, grid balancing becomes a problem. So we are expecting that storage. We have already started creating an ecosystem for storage. We are now having renewable plus storage projects coming up, but at a small scale. By after 2022, we need much more of storage, but the way the prices are falling, we expect it to become viable after that. So, and as far as the INDC, that commitment of India, that will be achieving much ahead of time.
So this is a big change from several years ago.
Yeah, as I said, as an opening remarks.
I mean, Thierry talked about Prime Minister, but
no,
this is a big
actually, that's
change.
the same thing, without naming him, but 2015 when this target came, that was a very ambitious target, because at that time the country was not there. We didn't have a linear path to the target of 2022. That time, as he said, we were thinking of 20 gigawatt by 2022. Now, target was fixed at 100 gigawatt of solar. So now we are at 30 gigawatt now already commissioned pumping power. If this target had not been set, we would still be somewhere around 15 gigawatt, 16 gigawatt, targeting 20 gigawatt by 2022. So fixing such ambitious targets are necessary, because even if they look very, very fanciful at that point of time, but that drives the entire system towards achieving this target. If you peg yourself lower, you will achieve low only. It's very difficult to go above what you are pegging yourself. So pegging yourself high is a very good. So I totally agree with what he said. 2015, the target which was set, that was the biggest driving force, which has led us to achieve this target.
Thierry?
I think Rana raised the most important subject, finance. Because government can say things, if finance doesn't follow up, it doesn't work. And it's true today, and you're right to point that today coal-fired projects are still financed, not that many, but still. And oil and gas certainly does get financed. There's a guy who's showed a model. It was a year and a half ago at the annual conference Arena. He was invited by then Secretary General Adnan Amin, and his name is Kingsmill Bond. Kingsmill is an analyst who works with a carbon tracker in London. He works with the City of London. And he's come together with a very interesting concept, which has today generated considerable thinking within the financial community. And that concept is the tipping point. So I'm going to explain it very quickly. The tipping point means that today some people are saying renewables don't count for much. They count for 10%, solar and wind count for 10% or 12% of solar, of electricity. That's roughly 3% of global energy demand. So people are saying, why on earth do you think this is serious? The serious stuff is the 97%. And he's come with a very simple analysis. He says, financial markets don't think in absolute terms, they think in differential terms. So they think how things are moving. And he said, on average, it has been more the last couple of years, but energy demand moves 1% annually. Renewables grow by 30% annually. So what we have today is renewables are not 3%, they're already 60% of the, they grow 20%. They're already 60, sorry for the numbers, 60% of growth today is already renewables. 60% of demand growth is absorbed. And what he's saying is that between 2022 and 2023, the rate of growth of renewables is going to eat into the whole package, the whole thing. Some people call that peak oil demand, not peak oil production. Means the moment where you have, where oil demand is going to go down. Shell, in its Sky scenario, puts it in 2025, an oil company. When that happens, you know what happens? Think about what happened in 2008 when people thought that suddenly the real estate market in the US could go down. Investors move out immediately. They run to the exits. And this is the tipping point. What Kingsmill Bond and some others are doing. I'll share with you a few months back, I was in a meeting organized by the Rocky Mountain Institute, a very big think tank in the US. We were in San Francisco, where we were with hedge funds, the most powerful hedge funds on the planet. And they were looking, how can we make hundreds of billions of dollars by betting against oil companies? You had some of the most powerful guys are saying, we're going to go after them, the way people went after the real estate companies in 10 years ago. We're going to short these companies. We're going to litigate. And they're scared. And they're scared today. And when you have the chairman of Shell today, the chairman of Shell is compensated on the basis of the reduction, his shareholders have said, you will be compensated on the basis of reduction of greenhouse emissions. The guy has said he's lost probably. I mean, no offense, he's lost. He's saying, I'm moving to electricity. I want to be the biggest electricity company in the world. Come on, he's been in gas and oil and gas for 120 years. He wants to exit the business. Well, he's not said it, but when he says, I want to go to electricity. So what we have with signs like that, it shows that we're this close to a moment where finance will find its way. And that's good news, because what we have here with project developers, we have to be ready to inspire trust. And that includes governments as well, to inspire trust to these trillions of dollars which are going to move out of fossil fuels. And there again, we're this far from it. And Europe is showing the way. So let's be optimistic on that and be ready, because honestly, it's going to be tough to manage.
Just to add a small story to his Shell story. Actually, our biggest fossil fuel power producer, National Thermal Power Corporation, has already shifted to solar, and one of the biggest solar power producer in the country, NTPC, and is expanding its solar portfolio. Rather, we jokingly tell that you are no longer National Thermal Power Company, we are National Total Power Company, or you should rename yourself as National Solar Power Company or something like that. The way they are expanding, and we have enabled them to slowly replace fossil fuel power with the renewable power within the same PPA. So that they are doing it. That's
They're a fine organization. Kadri, and then I'll turn to David.
Thanks. Just very briefly, we've touched on a couple of key issues, and I think if I compare emerging markets and with the let's say the more developed world, and then I think one has to be cognizant of just a couple of differences which one has to factor into our decision making. I look at the South African context again very briefly, and one of the issues we had in our uptake of renewable energy was actually opposition, stiff opposition from the coal mining sector, to the point where in fact they took us to court. And so we need to appreciate, I think as well, that there's a sector of the economy that's at risk when one contemplates the employment opportunities. And so the need for us to reskill or upskill our labor force to take into consideration this transition is also going to be vital. The second thing is the number of interconnections that you do have on your electricity network. South Africa is the backbone of the electricity network for most of sub-Saharan Africa. When that market collapses, it is inevitable that the rest of the electricity supply network will collapse around it. It is not necessarily the same in Europe. And so the dynamics around preservation of a model, no matter how outdated it is, no matter how dependent it is on fossil fuels, is critical also to the survival of the surrounding region. And what that has prompted in our particular example is the resultant step by the city to take over responsibility from a national government that is continuing to build new coal-fired plants that will have a life of 60 to 80 years, when we as a city have decided that that's not the way that we are going. We take our commitments seriously. So the commitments to decarbonize and to be carbon neutral by 2050 is one that we are serious about, and we've taken that decision as a city. And so the message I want to give to you is that we as cities, or we as states, within a framework which is controlled by national government, can still be proactive. And I think, Thierry, you mentioned New York, California as good examples. I'd like to count Cape Town as one of those examples of, as I said to you, where there's a court challenge. We're willing to take our own national government to court to assert our right to go clean. And so the message is, we can do it. If we take the lead as cities and as states, we can make that difference.
David?
Sure. So I just wanted to say I agree with a number of points there, specifically on the technology side, and thinking about how the technology is really there to go to fully renewable power systems, and that's all very exciting. I think kind of one point of optimism in my experience here in India, when I started coming here 4 to 5 years ago, I often got the question, how much RE can go on our grid? And I would kind of that was a common question for us, but I think, the answer is as much as you want. And right now it's probably going to cost a lot of money, but the technology is there. So if you want to do it, it certainly can be done. But I've stopped getting that question so much in more recent years. So I think the more understanding from the technical institutions in India has really helped drive toward the 175 gigawatt target, and so I think that's kind of one point of optimism. Just wanted to point out, and what we found is that transparency has helped a lot in the way that some policies might be articulated from the government, and then trying to figure out how that all works, whether that's in some sort of research or trying to work towards those goals. Transparency will help a lot in bringing along all the institutions that are involved in that, in the financing, and being able to see how this is all going to work from a technical perspective, from a financing perspective, and allowing everybody to see that, I think really helps the perception of getting to those goals. And I guess one other point about, India is a very diverse place, and the states have very different goals that they're thinking about, kind of all driven from the top down, from the central government. But I think to reach all of these different goals, I think it needs to be recognized that it doesn't necessarily need to be the same process for every state. These states have very different political objectives and even cultural parts of their state that need to be, that will probably change the path that each of them goes. And I think it needs to be recognized that it doesn't need to be the same for all, even if the goal is decarbonization. Recognizing that this can all kind of work from the bottom up, and states can figure out their own path is kind of important, and being able to give them the tools to do that is ultimately going to help the country reach its goals, and other emerging economies as well.
Thank you. Rana, last word?
Maybe to come back to a session we spoke this morning about energy access and more decentralized solutions, and I think it was also part of this. We're far away of the hydrogen part, but I think maybe bringing things also to cities like Cape Town, but also villages. I do see a clear opportunity in the electricity sector also, which is building on the decentralized nature of electricity production, of mini-grids, which can also lead a way, and I think there are many questions on the way. We do not always have the answers because we do not have 100 years of coal-fired power plants when we're talking about renewable energy, but there are opportunities to also build the electricity system, transmission, distribution lines, here more distribution, on a much more decentralized approach. And I think this is something where today we have, there are technological solutions, and these are opportunities actually, and I think here the cities, for instance, do need the possibilities to decide where they buy their electricity from. They need to be empowered for this. There is an opportunity for city utilities. There is also the opportunity for community energy, which can then also address again public acceptance, but also the fact that also in structural areas like Kevin mentioned, the coal mining sector, where there is clearly an impact if we're moving away from coal on jobs, but a possibility to also associate these players to the gains such a transition can bring. And I think this is something where we spoke about innovation, technology innovation, yes, is probably still needed, even though many solutions are there. I think when we're talking about innovation here, it's much more about the innovation also of our way of thinking about the different solutions, about the governance model and the players to involve in such a transition.
Yes, Tim.
Yeah, I'll just rebound on your very important message. I think we should not see this world between the new and fight between the new and the old, the clean and the dirty, it is how to leverage on an existing world and existing infrastructure. I'll give you two very concrete examples. Right now in Europe, we have put together a task force which brings all the gas transmission companies, nearly all, a majority of them, of Europe. Enagás from Spain, GRT Gas from France, Snam from Italy, OG from Germany. We are planning with them the mass conversion of their business, of their natural gas business to hydrogen zero carbon gas business. And they like it. Why? Because today when you are Gasunie in the Netherlands or Gaz de France, where you have falling volumes and suddenly you have the perspective of having a new stuff, zero carbon, filling your pipes, that is jobs for your people. That is money for your shareholders. They're happy with it. So, and I'll give you another example. Right now, Tokyo Gas in Japan is studying the massive import of zero carbon ammonia, which is a byproduct of hydrogen, to put in its coal-fired plants. Which means that existing coal-fired plants can be turned into a much lower carbon emission thing with, there again, a product from solar or wind. So the solutions are there, the business model are there, what, I didn't say what lacks, but what is needed now is initiatives, projects. Europe is showing the way. Japan is showing the way. We think that India has a window of opportunity to do it and to reuse its existing infrastructure networks, including its coal-fired plants. It's not just the idea is not to dump them, certainly not, and certainly not the people with it. Same thing with South Africa. So the idea, the message to all these people is that you're not just fossil people. You can be part of this new world, and your infrastructures and your jobs and your competences can be reused. That's a message of hope, including, especially for those people who think they have a lot to lose in this transition.
Thank you very much. Now my controller from the floor has signaled that we need to get the hell out of here. So we will do that. I thank my panel, David, Rana, Mr. Saurav Kumar, Thierry, Kadri, Praveen Kumar. So many Kumars. But let me just say one thing on behalf of you and myself, and I think India is surprising the world now on clean energy, and I think we will surprise the world even more in the next few years, in a very good way, in a very positive way. Thank you very much. Thank you.